Well, welcome. Thank you for coming this morning and taking this opportunity to talk with us and for us to, and all of you for sticking around another day to talk together about what is Opera Lafayette's first inaugural New York festival around a particular theme, obviously the Era of Marie Antoinette rediscovered. So I'd like to start by reintroducing everyone up here. So in case you weren't at all the programs or didn't recognize, haven't met everyone yet. To my far right, Victor Sigard, who was, of course, Sylvain in our opera on Monday night, and who last night was also participated in a large way in the program, bigger than I had expected, actually. It was weird. And to his left is Julia Doe, the musicologist from Columbia University, who has written in the book about Marie Antoinette, and Sandrine Chatron, who put together the Salon of Marie Antoinette, the program, the wonderful harpist. I don't know if any of you, when you came in this morning, saw a harp in the room to the right down there, which is historic. Did you get a chance to see it?
Very quickly, but I would take it.
To my left, Callum Blackmore, who is, in fact, a doctoral student of Julia's and others at Columbia, who's teaching there himself. Sylvia Rodriguez, who is an anthropologist from the University of New Mexico. Maria Mondragon Valdez, who is both an historian, actually similarly had been a student of Sylvia's, and is an amazing community activist in San Luis, Colorado. Laurent Dubois, who is a professor at, well, it's the University of Virginia now, but it's specifically a democracy initiative.
That's right, yeah.
Which you're heading up there. And finally, Kayama Glover, who is at Columbia Barnard, and whose specialty is French and African studies, right?
Yes.
More or less.
Literary study.
You can literally, and so we have a wide range of experience. Speaking to what I hope you found it was a wide-ranging program this week, considering that we focused on just a few decades and the so-called era of Marie Antoinette. So I thought, I don't know. We haven't organized the specific, but keep your questions in hand there, and because we'd love to hear some of your reactions. I guess I'd like to start because Laurent and Kayama, though they've written about the program that Pedro Lemelsdorff put together last night, they hadn't heard it before, and I wonder, Laurent and Kayama, where you could speak, having studied the situation and the music, or at least knowing the theater scene in Saint-Domingue. What were the surprises that you heard last night? What surprised you about it as historians, and finally hearing the music that Annette actually sang or that was performed?
I actually want to start with a quick question. I'm sure it's burning everyone's mind. What was that instrument in the front stage left? We look forward in the program, so I know this is probably a question for us.
Oh, probably the organ. You mean with the long
with the double neck string?
No, I guess that's a lute with an extension for extra bass strings. Okay. That is was used a lot in the 17th century. And there are various versions of it, but sometimes when you don't have a harpsichord and you can't go to those low notes, that long extension gives you the bass notes to be able to accompany a singer with. So it's usually, sometimes there's a smaller version called an arch flute, but it was a little different, but that I think was a zero.
Very convenient to play for Louis XIV when you woke up. There was composers who take the oboe, play for Louis XIV, that's you wake up.
Yes, we should always start.
Thank you very much. That really was just perturbing me throughout the performance. But beyond that, to answer your question, I think that, I was talking about this earlier with Maria and with Sylvia, it was extraordinary, I think, to see rendered in music something that I think about in the context of literature, which is the taking up of traces and creating new, rich, deep and layered art from it. And that became incredibly apparent as someone who is not actually a historian, contrary to what might be the belief, since I work very much with Noel, who is a historian. I look at the world and I look at the past through literature. And so I'm very attuned to the need to and the desire to speculate into the past to kind of get a sense of what these things mean in the present. And so seeing that come to light on stage was really just an incredible opportunity. And I want to applaud Pedro for kind of creating scenographically the dynamism and the changeability of the period. Just the fact that the musicians and the singers didn't remain in one place, one part of the stage, that he himself moved about the stage and created this sonic and visual spectacle that made me think of the busyness, the dynamism, and the shifting tides of what would have been the theater world then.
It was unusually theatrical concert program, really well considered in terms of putting one piece through making it. He makes these little enchaînements that connect one to the next that aren't necessarily there. There's a little bit of recomposition that is sort of helping, but in the spirit, I think, of a lot of improvisation from earlier periods. And then, of course, the larger structure of going from the messe to the concert spirituel and back to the messe was, in addition to those little enchaînements, were quite striking and well considered. Yeah.
And I mean, there was just a moving aspect to it, which was to sort of really hear some things that Minette had sung that at least I had read about in the novels or elsewhere, but hadn't yet heard. I hadn't heard those pieces. And that sense of almost moving into the past or from past to present, right? Being both in past and present through the performance was very powerful, I thought. I also believe what really became apparent is one of the reasons why there can be such creolization and multiplication of different engagements with this work in a place like the Caribbean through different cultures, right? So with African and indigenous cultures interacting with European is just because the music itself is so complex and varied, right? So you could sort of see how creolization can happen in part because there's all these points of entry, right? And all of these symbolic landscapes that are being evoked, like with the flute or others, and all of these deep philosophical questions as well as just personal human ones. So that helped. That's something I've written about and thought about, is just how people could take, hear these plays and interpret them in a certain way in the Caribbean. And that became really visible because you could sort of see all the ways you could angle into them.
You could see it. Some people may have seen it one way and some never, yes.
I don't mean to interrupt the dialogue, but I may be the only one here who only went to the salon and the dinner, so I did not see, sadly, this performance or the one that you starred in. So I'm wondering a couple of things. Could you share with us some photos as a follow-up to this, of these productions? If not, a video of some of the thing that we could look at online. And secondly, as you're making your remarks, could you provide a little background for those of us who haven't seen it as to why you're saying what you're saying as it relates to the topic of the program? Thank you.
Good. We'll do a little background.
I
And
don't
we'll also
need favor, but I want to get
yeah, and we'll also point out that we have a lot of information here, which no one could possibly read before the program. So that's why we're giving you something nice to take home, so you can read it afterwards. There's an essay by Laurent and Kayam. There's an essay by Maria Mondragon, and there's an essay by Julia, in addition to program notes by others and Callum. And
Your introduction actually does incredible work situating the whole of the festival. And it's
well,
not
then,
about-
that you could read, and just right here.
In 2 minutes.
I spent more than 2 minutes on it, but
Once you read it, it's
Oh, thank you.
right. It's beautiful.
That's the letter from the artistic director.
I intend to read all this.
But so yes, but and of course not everyone has seen all 3 programs by any means. It's a big week. And Karen, you had a question too.
Yeah, stylistically, I was really struck by how many times Pedro, the conductor last night, had a long pause on, and I wondered if that was in the music or if it's something he's developed stylistically because of his researches, but it's striking.
Well, I might speculate, but perhaps Victor would have a better idea. Some of the pauses, I noticed, for instance, he always had the flute have the last word imitating the violin, which I wasn't sure was always in the music, but
The long pauses about me, because they just kept happening in these odd places, and they were dramatic, but I didn't know that they were written in.
Yeah, to be honest, we didn't discuss about this with Pedro. I can say that Pedro has worked a lot on this program, so probably, and he's researched a lot, so I guess, it was in purpose to make the connections.
Well, it was just within the piece. It was just within the piece.
Yeah, it did.
Just at the end.
No, within the piece, I think.
Yes, within the piece, yeah. So it's,
a lot of places, a lot of dramatic pauses and stops and stuff. And I should.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like it's the way he conducts music in general, or if that's for the program. This I don't know.
You didn't have anything in your music.
No, we didn't have those in the music. So it's all him connecting, his way of connecting. Even his way of conducting the Pergolese Stabat Mater is it's the first time I heard it like this. So I guess, but I got to know him a bit, and he's researched and got so hard on the program that perhaps it's something he found somewhere in a book or a manuscript. And then they used to have pauses like this, but this I cannot promise.
No, actually, this question came up just yesterday too. Is this is a reimagining of what was happening. None of us can, although we use period instruments and we try to research the period, but in the end, we bring our imagination to it, and then, I think in Pedro's case last night, of course, he wrote down a lot of the ornaments for the singers, so extensive ornaments, and whether they would have been ones that were stylistic from the period that people have used is another whole question. But I think that there's inevitably and happily there's a great deal of artistic freedom that goes into these performances, and what we're representing exactly is I don't think we can say, but we can say that each of these pieces and most of the expressive things that we are hearing were something that somebody felt hundreds of years ago too. As our teacher together used to say about electricity. Albert Fuller used to say about this is our through music we can know how somebody used to feel. It's almost like we have this electric connection, but that's which is an anachronism. Anyway. Where shall we also? There's a lot. I'm also interested, particularly in what some of you who were involved in one program but who attended the others thought. What your experience or what kind of things seemed to resonate between the programs. And I wonder if Maria or Sylvia, who were deeply involved in our Sylvain and our setting of it, and the land rights issues that inspired us to set it in northern Mexico, southern Colorado. Whether and neither of you being musicians, but being anthropologists and historians and active citizens of the area, what coming to a music festival and hearing this stuff realized through music or meant to you, and how do you have some things you might like to say about the way other programs might have resonated? Sylvia, you want to give it a try?
Sure, I'm still processing this. It's been a wild ride, and it's truly, I'm still processing it because I never realized the scope of this program initially. And I think now that I've seen the last performance, it's starting to coalesce a little bit. I've always wondered what Ryan's vision was in bringing us into this and then putting us in this context. And so I'm still kind of astonished by the range and by the questions that Certainly the others, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about music or able to speak about it in any kind of musically sophisticated way. The scholarly articles and their talks have certainly stimulated me and raised questions that had not occurred to me. And never thought much about Marie Antoinette. And of course, there's a whole new window onto Marie Antoinette and who she was and what she did. Of course, Haiti has always interested me from a distance because of not only its past, but its present, and the whole issue of syncretism, which of course is important in Haiti. Our perspective, or my perspective, was it just so happened that Ryan was at the Wurlitzer Foundation in Towson, asked the former director, who's someone I grew up with, you know anybody who does research on land and water? Ryan and Michael mentioned me, and I really study interethnic relations among a variety of sort of a spectrum of ethnic groups in the Southwest, particularly northern New Mexico. So I've looked at the effects of tourism on identity and on the economy, ritual expression through how the relations among people are expressed through ritual forms, and conflict over land and water, which has always been a theme since I always bring it back to land and water. And I realized over the scope of my work that I was always talking about land and water and landscape and topography, because I think certainly in the Southwest and where I come from, it's fundamentally important. And I think if you don't get the hydrology and you don't get the lay of the land, and you say you're a historian who works in the archives, you don't get it. And probably with every topic, you need to really go across disciplines. You can't be truly interdisciplinary, but there's a multiplicity of perspectives. So I still have a lot of questions, Ryan, about this, and maybe as we talk and we have the conversation, more will come out, because I am astonished by the scope of this. And I keep trying to figure out sort of what was in your head. And what does this mean? And, how do we know what
It's empty up here in Tulsa.
How do we understand people's emotions of 300 years ago when it's hard enough today, right? So all of these things really fascinate me. So let me pass it on to Maria, and then maybe we can get more of a conversation going. And if any of you have questions, I noticed that in the New Yorker, there is an article, which I haven't gotten to, but a friend sent me, on the enclosure of the commons that I assume at the beginning of private property. And of course, Maria is someone who's lived through the enclosure of the commons, which is why I recommended Ryan to speak to her, because her life has been involved in the struggle over a land grant. But all struggles, I think, in the West and in New Mexico go back to the land and the water. So anyway, let me pass it on to you, Maria.
Well, in the beginning, when Ryan came, it just said, why us? Like, how am I related to Marie Antoinette? How is our community related to Marie Antoinette? And then when I started reading and doing my own research online and just reading as much as I could about the French in the genealogy and, birth and death records, I just saw how interrelated we were to the French Quebecois that came in into the 1820s. Then that's when I found one of our ancestors took off with the Frenchmen in 1820s. And so there were, and the interrelations between women and power and family. And also one of the important things is that we live on French long lots in our community. And they're called water strips, but the French brought this into our community. We had common lands to the lowlands and to the uplands. And so you end up growing up not really knowing the historic background. So this is what this brought to me. I started, looking and seeing that what we had was a replica of France, and it was superimposed in our community, and it's a million acres more. And so here we had 5 men, predominantly French, that ended up owning 8 million acres in southern Colorado within 20 years. And this is where we live. And I was shocked because why didn't I know this? Here I did my dissertation on land loss, but it was just, we ignored that part. But then it just hitting me in the face. And the interconnection with the clergy. We had French missionaries in our community since day one. And so we didn't know all of this intertwining. And so that's what I learned. And basically the common lands and how that's what in land struggles. And, we were kind of in a way, in a strange way, French revolutionaries in southern Colorado. We picked that up, and but not that the French came in, but we had so many individuals that were intertwined that actually ended up being land grant advocates in our community, and we just never knew that. And we have all these French names, and it's in our DNA. So I never knew that.
And so when Victor says, as Sylvain, he says, the new owner has even forbid our right to hunt. I thought, my God, this is just what I'm hearing from Maria and the people of San Luis when Jack Taylor in 1960 built this fence around those tens of thousands of acres on the edge of San Luis, and trying to keep out the people who had been using that land since the 1850s when they settled it. So that was essentially the inspiration there. And I think one of the agricultural issues, one of the reasons to step back for a minute, Marie Antoinette, when we think of her, what do we think of? Unfortunately, it's either let them eat cake or the hameau, and that she built. But there's to understand the agricultural issues in France, which Callum has helped us do in his notes, and you begin to think there's something more to this than just playing on your farm. There's something there are larger issues at stake, which Callum has written about in terms of agriculture. But there are also these, when you mentioned the French Revolution and there's something I think which ties in all three of our programs. Kayama has translated Dance on the Volcano, which is it is like just before the Haitian Revolution. A lot of these land issues and the resentment of the French getting these 8 million acres and being connected with the Americans who are coming in it becomes this heightened essentially revolution in Taos in 1847, and here here we are, of course, in France, dealing with these issues leading up to a much better, well-known revolution. And so all these forces are about to lead to violence in each of these places, and that's been striking to me, and that not always reconciled by getting your grandfather coming in and everything's fine, and yes, and you two will recognize the dishonest family, and that sometimes virtue is more important than high birth, etc., the final lines of Sylvain. But I mainly would like to speak to that, Julia. Would you because opera comique in general, and one of the you notice there was Kaitley on every program. He was a through composed and a theme in a way too. And I don't know how you might like to speak to some of those.
Yeah, this question, I think what was really fascinating, and this goes back to the initial question again, is how do we trace the intersections between these programs? What they really demonstrated for me was the extreme afterlife of some of this music, the way that this music was used in such a broad diversity of context, and how, in fact, many composers who maybe you hadn't heard of their music was present in all of these hugely important, historically fraught situations and voiced by different people. I mean, I might go back, maybe not even to Great Tree, but I was struck in listening to these programs by the music of Martini, Jean-Paul Legide Martini, who, if you saw the Music in Marie Antoinette Salon program, he's the composer of the final extract, Plaisir d'amour, and maybe is known for that love song, that popular love song from the 18th century, later, of course, popularized in the 20th century by maybe Piaf and maybe even stolen by Elvis.
Elvis Presley.
Yeah, and so like the most blatant example of this like long-standing transferal of these musical works. But I was actually thinking of it more. So there was also a lot of Martini on the final program, the program that happened yesterday. I was just talking to Laurent and Callum about this. I was struck by this piece. So on the final program were some extracts by Martini from an opera called La Rue de 15 ans from the early 1770s, I believe. And this originated as a courtly opera. So it was written for a royal wedding in France in the early 1770s. So this music originates in this high courtly context. It is then immediately taken up by other members of the French aristocracy. It becomes very popular for performing extracts like in your country home. So it's much like Marie Antoinette would have done performing music by herself or with her friends. It's very popular because it's sort of about a party, and so you could make it about the party that you are throwing in your aristocratic party home, in your aristocratic home. And then of course it is extracted both as a full opera, but also as these little greatest hits, and then spread throughout the French colonial empire, where ultimately it ends up voiced, as we saw, by the singer Minette in Saint-Domingue. So we have this courtly work that then spreads throughout that is at some point in France sung by aristocrats, and then eventually is sung in a wildly different context in Saint-Domingue, which is really revealing both the spread of French culture, but also how that French culture is always undergirded by the economic system of the colonial empire. So just this one, a work by a composer who maybe you've never heard of, but was everywhere. And it was showing us so much about both the court system and, as the system of enslavement in the Caribbean. So it's just this little piece of music, and it can be a portal to so many different contexts.
I was struck during your program, Sanjean. I mean, we had that backdrop created so that we'd have something other than a black curtain to look for. So of course it's very the 3-year program, and it's very it's of the period, very much of the period, and it has the kind of the filigree and the very delicate filigree, which and immediately when we started listening to you, you think, oh my gosh, what delicate and instrument, and how beautiful, and how precise, and how and the aesthetic of your evening, had so, and the salon aesthetic, and is one thing, and it's what a contrast to Pedro, who calls himself his group Arlequin Philosophe, and who is doing these wild freedoms with that Karen mentioned, with pauses and this and things, and rewriting things, and I don't know. I wonder whether he also is trying to and suggest the what do we call it, syncretic, when you add the African drums in the second part of the mass, and suggest that it was absorbed, and that Catholicism, that Catholic music was then used by runaway slaves and continued to be sung in their villages. And then you're adding another a layer of some kind of another layer of artistic stuff on it, and you're taking a very different approach, and so I wonder, something you were in all 3 programs, and how speak to us a little about how you see that.
I want to echo what you just said about the fact that musicians, composers were traveling a lot, and the music becomes a symbolism of circulation, economical and political and cultural circulation between the different courts and societies, and also the music goes from the aristocracy to the bourgeoisie. Also, some music were taken, I think, by all the population, in fact, and became beyond their first purpose. And in the program of Pedro, I was really fascinated by the way he connected all the pieces. And in my part, I played a small piece by Philippe Iner, who was the teacher of Marie Antoinette, art teacher of Marie Antoinette for 10 years. And it's really interesting because he was in Saint-Domingue, I think, when he was a child.
French piano.
Where was he?
Right, it's, he was, you don't know? In Kourou.
And he, the theme he used to write his sonata was a theme by Tremé that he heard when he was a child there. So he was really nicely connected to my program also, because then after it was the half.
I asked him to put that on the program, actually.
Okay.
but he knew all the connections. What he did was, and this is, we refer to French piano, so it's not really all this music's from Saint-Domingue de Metz. It was found in French Guiana, and this, he's written a lot about this colony of the French tried, and I will speak, maybe all can speak more precisely to this, but they tried to create a colony in Kourou that was not an enslaved colony, but was a sort of colony of indentured servants from the edge of the French from the German border, and that included, that's why Hinner, the German name, and as a child, he was taken to this colony. And 2,000 of the 3,000 people, or 2,800 of the 3,000 people died.
But more than that, actually, it was one of the biggest mass deaths in early colonial history. It was this utter disaster where almost all the settlers died within a few months in Guyana from disease.
All settlers from the outer
They were
parts.
mostly Germans, actually. They were mostly Germans who had already traveled across France and then were shipped to this new. And it was a series. There were a series of French colonial experiments to kind of create these utopian new ideas. I mean, in some ways, even the building in New Orleans had some of that. But it's a really striking story, and it kind of vanishes into the ether. But it does tell you a lot about that, and it had all these implications in France and beyond. Because
The French bless them for having us here today, but they did try to cover it up for a long time, I think, right?
Yeah.
Because it was a terrible disaster. But Philip Inner, as a young virtuoso harpist, was there with his family. They were musicians brought. They were anticipating, as you say, utopian community with art, but he survived, and he went on to become Marie Antoinette's harp teacher, which was an extraordinary connection. Yes, Dan.
Clearly, the French were very much in Saint-Domingue, but they were also in many of the other Caribbean islands where they alternated with the British on a regular basis. Did you find any influence of English music in what you studied? Is there any demonstration of that?
Well, that's interesting. That's not something I've really thought about. Maybe do you, Julia? Have you've done some work? You've done the work on Saint-Domingue too, haven't you? And I don't know whether there's any. Is there?
Maybe Nisa.
Well, in the 18th century, it was the other way around. Except for Handel, primarily, it was French influencing as well English as well as German music. So it's kind of whatever you would get from England would be an Englishized, Frenchified.
Yes, there are one example. We did Monsigny's and the Deserteur, for instance. We found that it was so popular that the English took it and sort of created a story with some of their own songs, and so there were a lot of these movies which were taken up by the English, and in fact some of the versions that were done in America, where there were English versions done as well as the French troops after the Asian Revolution came up and did them in French in some of the eastern seaboard
I would just mention there's one kind of triangle within the Caribbean that's culturally very interesting, which is that Kingston and then the southern peninsula of Haiti and then eastern Cuba, so Santiago, are really, really close to each other. And so I think there was actually quite a bit of influence between Jamaica and Haiti. In the 18th century and the 19th century, contraband trade constantly, and there's these kind of places of circulation, and then within the Eastern Caribbean too, other kinds of circulation. So that's one where I think there was this kind of influence that was a little bit different than what was in the European context, because again, in some ways these places were more tightly linked than they were to other parts of the colonies. If that makes sense.
And did Antoinette go to Cuba before she went to the United States?
We believe so. There's some debate now about that. But that was where the route that a lot of Saint-Domingue refugees who ended up in New Orleans, most of them spent many years in Cuba first. And so again, these places were really connected. But one thing I would just say about the kind of violence and revolution question is that I think the thing to remember when thinking about all this theatrical work is that all of these places we're talking about are essentially mostly non-literate, non-reading societies, right? There's a small group of people in France, everywhere else, who's able to read. But the most important vector for ideas, actually, I would argue in this period, was theater. That was the place that most people were going to hear about. So when Voltaire and Rousseau and Guattari and all these others are or in Sylvain and others, are kind of sharing basically political ideas, often through a narrative form, or they're just writing comic operas but that raise questions about relationships and family. All these kinds of, so when we think about the era of the Enlightenment, people really think about the salons of Paris or written texts being circulated, but there's this much huger world of these plays that are vehicling a lot of the same ideas, and that anyone can hear. No one has to be able to read to hear. And so I think, and this is what we see in Saint-Domingue, and I think it's true in France, but it's true throughout these contexts, is that because we sort of forget that even during the French Revolution, right, most people are really, they're talking more than they're reading or writing. And so I think there's a place just to argue that in general about all these connections, that theater is, if you think about what changes in the world in the 18th century and how popular ideas could circulate it, was really, really important. In part because of the ways that people could take it and rewrite it. You could rewrite the endings of plays. You could turn a tragedy into a romance. There's all these versions of things that get twisted around. And artists had a lot of leeway, in these places. They could. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. And that's why I think there is often sometimes a link between theater and revolution. In that sense and you see that throughout the Haitian Revolution, that people are evoking theatrical metaphors in various ways.
I should say too that with music, you can also, a composer can change the meaning of the text by the way he sets it. You hear, we talk about Mozart doing this often. In his operas, somebody's saying one thing, but the music is telling you something a little bit different underneath, or something more than the text is telling you. And in our Claysley opera, you remember the daughter, Paulina, who's to marry the young farmer, Basile, sing her first aria is all about, she said, Louis Jean, who you heard last time, also sang that role. And she's thinking about how, in contrast to her father having gone off and married without his parents' consent, she is telling her mother, well, Basile, my mother asks, is Basile the one for you? And she says, well, he loves you and father and shouldn't I therefore love him? And she does love him, but she's just sort of feeling obedient, to this malleable, and just beginning to find herself at the age, whatever it is, 15, that she's getting married. And in the text of the aria, I've never seen this in music, but Guattari writes, and a place where she said this several times, but she's beginning to question it. And it says, avec confusion. And then he puts this G flat, which is not anywhere near the key. It's a real blue note that he sort of holds up the music. And so she has to slow down and sing it. And instead of being a statement, that she's asking it as a question. And you feel like she's asking it of herself, And So I guess the larger point is that the theater does this, and music animates theater in a way, in so many wonderful, subtle ways. And as my gosh, last night that quartet in Maman Statues is amazing, kind of an amazing piece, and also a good to me.
Can I say something? So also about the text, what I learned from Pedro when we looked at the first piece we sang yesterday, just the second piece actually, but there is to the Jesuits would use the music and the text, and the way the Jesuits changed the stress, musical stress on the words.
The Jesuits.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, sorry, my accent like that. But they would normally, if it was performed in metropoles in France, it would be, there was a phrase which was le seul Seigneur, and the musical stress would be on Seigneur, so the Lord. And the Jesuits, I don't know how to say this. And they checked because they wanted to teach the slaves that they normally had many gods, and they now had to have one god. The stress is on le seul Seigneur. So instead of going le seul Seigneur, I had to sing le seul Seigneur. So the Lord is not so important anymore. It's the only one that's important. So that as US, yeah.
I think Laurent made a very, very astute point, speaking on the oral tradition, since not everyone could read it, right? That same oral tradition is very prominent in music. There's a lot of music that is only learned orally. And so it's very interesting to think about, in the colonies particularly, that kind of double oral tradition, a musical oral tradition and a word oral tradition in the basis.
And it still exists. One of the something we did, I don't know if some of you may have seen it, while we were in Taos, we did several online programs. One with Sylvia and a French historian, Judith Miller, and one with Maria and Tanya. We did another with two indigenous Taos Pueblo members. One, our costume designer, Patricia Michaels, and the other, a Taos elder who had been president of the tribe, Gilbert Swazo, a man in his 80s. And I wanted to talk a little separately about how it's interesting that how the Taos Pueblo takes up Catholicism, yet maintains its own kivas and traditions and maintains both. But that's a separate point to the one I wanted to make. As we finish the conversation, and we'll have this online, I think Gilbert has allowed it to be online. He's very he's very needs to know exactly how the tribe is being portrayed in any public place other than when the tribe says it. And but as we were talking to at the end of the conversation, he did say how much he sang. He learned singing, and of course they don't have any written tradition of music. But supposedly Aaron Copland went to the Taos Pueblo and could not for the life of him figure out the rhythms that they were working on, But he says he would learn these songs from his grandfather, and there's this great oral tradition is still going on there, which they keep very much to themselves. Sylvia could probably speak to this, but he was. And he talked also about how that was one of the ways he would go to other tribes in the United States, and they would share songs, and they would share, and then they would recognize each other's certain similarities in each other's songs, and that's in his lifetime in the last 40 to 50 years. The reason we especially got Gilbert to speak was because he was one of the last people who was there in 1970 in Washington when Richard Nixon signed over the 60,000 plus acres of Taos Mountain, which had been traditionally belonged to the Taos Pueblo, but in 1906 was taken away and given to the Forest Service. So there was a reclamation of their sacred mountain that happened in 1970. And as a young man, he was a part of that process, which was when we were talking about land reclamation. It was, but he also it was so interesting to hear him speak about the meaning of music to him and communicating with and developing this relationship with other tribes around the country. So, yes.
This makes me think that the research that's developed, the observations that developed at Alzheimer's patients, you can't say a sentence, you can sing the words to a song they remember. The words come back with the music. So music really does reinforce the verbal.
Yeah, and I think even if you think of drumming in the Atlantic world or these sorts of things, you're right, but I think the music communicates, it communicates messages and all sorts of things. And it can kind of resonate and stay within people in ways people aren't even necessarily aware of, but then, you hear a certain, and I do think that's, the other thing is that there's very early on a lot of cross influence. So for instance, in Virginia in the late 18th century, there was something called the Congo minuet that the kind of planters liked to dance to. It was played by Black musicians. And there was this kind of recognition of, so there's also these places where music kind of, it's subversive in certain ways, because if somebody really likes the way something sounds, they might cross a barrier that they wouldn't normally, right, where there's a kind of way. And also because dance and music are kind of embodied in certain ways, so I think there's this way, when you mentioned this yesterday in our talk, just that there's ways in which there's, these social hierarchies or legal hierarchies are built, and in many ways, often culture kind of presses against them or, shakes them a little bit. Maybe can't overthrow them, but there's an interesting dynamic there.
Julia, you went with the opera comique and where it got its start and tunes that everybody knew but put new words to, really. It's such a huge...
Yeah,
it's huge.
Indeed. Yeah, so the many of the works on these programs are of course tied together through this genre of opera comique or French comic opera. Begins at the suburban seasonal fairs of Paris as entirely based upon these tunes called vaudeville, which are popular tunes, the songs from the streets that are then given new words in a theatrical context. So can you put it's a very intertextual process where you might be completely undercutting, say, the meaning of the original song by giving it new text. I was actually quite struck in the final program, or in the putting together of the Maison Cantique, is dealing with a similar musical process, and that he is reconstructing this music in Shipit. So knowing the name of the air to which this music might have been sung. But for example, I wish he was here to ask about, but so for example, one of these religious songs is sung to the tune of, when you have wine, basically, from champagne. What a way to be inculcating a political or ideological message through a popular tune that everyone, that was so striking, this very serious religious music is set to, popular drinking songs. During the French Revolution, there's actually a tradition of singing the Constitution. So people, there are all of these new constitutions coming out in the French Revolution, and one way to teach people who could read the Constitution about that is teaching them songs that translate the articles of the Constitution. And that's not always that accurate. You can tell people sort of the wrong meanings of the Constitution, or what meaning you think about things. This is a bad Constitution. By the musical tunes you're choosing for that, yeah.
So I should say something about ritual form here, because obviously theater and ritual are historically connected. But the Franciscans really were the missionaries who did the first wave of indoctrination in New Mexico, but this begins also in central Mexico, using ritual forms to Christianize Native people. And it's a non-discursive form of encoding a tremendous amount of information. And this is often one of the areas where you get syncretic forms, where you have Catholic or Christian forms syncretizing with Native forms, so that saints sort of become identified with Native deities. And so there are dances that the Spanish brought with them to Christianize Indians in central Mexico that traveled north. And they still are performed today. The Mapuchinas dance, which I did a book on years ago, performed by both Hispanic villagers and some Pueblo peoples. It reenacts, I think, the same ritual form, which probably has different meaning for different people, but they all agree that it really does, in some sense, signify the coming of the Virgin to the Pueblo people, who retain their own religion, but also are deeply Catholic, which is, I think, one of the great paradoxes of how did that happen and how do they maintain that? And anthropologists have got a word for it, which they call compartmentalization. But the whole notion of ritual and dance and movement, you've got a whole range of kinesthetic and somatic ways in which messages are telegraphed and remembered that may not have words at all. And so that's an important thing. I think interface between theater and ritual, I think, is really important in talking about these kinds of communication and how things are remembered.
I was interested to hear both of you comment a little bit about dance, because I've been wondering myself what was going on with dance during this period, and maybe you could comment on, in Marie Antoinette's salon, was dance incorporated with some of the music that we heard? Did she spark development of new dances? And then when you get to the colonies and these rhythms that you're referring to, how did they transform some of these local rhythms to what we're discussing now? Or did they? I don't know.
I know that Marie Antoinette was really helping Gluck to come in Paris, and because she knew Gluck from her childhood, he was her harpsichord teacher then, and at the court in Vienna, Gluck was already well known there, and also the French choreographer Nover. And so Gluck brought Nover in Paris, and then it's really revolutionized the way the dance ballet were put into operas. But I think maybe Julian knows much more about it than me.
And one thing we could say about what happens to dance in this period is actually there are a lot of opera comique adaptations done just in dance. So the idea that you could make this art form that is so well traveled even more travelable by doing it in pantomime. So say taking some of the operas that Opera Lafayette has done, the Royal Le Deserteur was very, very popular in a non-sung version, but in a version where you get like a description of what was happening in a program, and then people would pantomime it out to that popular music. And actually that becomes very important. In Saint-Domingue, it happens, and also in the United States later on in the 18th century. So this idea that, I mean, they don't speak French everywhere, but they could see French theater through dance. Yeah, but I don't know, someone else, I don't want to monopolize, someone else want to talk about the popular dance forms.
Oh yeah, I think what strikes me about this period is the extent to which dance starts to infiltrate other forms of music, especially comic opera. I mean, a lot of the opera comique music that you heard across these programs, they're dance forms originally. And, you know, you get a little hints of the minuet in Grétry's work and so on. And dance, and we saw this a bit of these wonderful divertissements from Lafayette. It's so easy to adapt to different contexts. You can take one little dance form and then put it in a something like the concert spirituel and see it in a different light. And I mean, something that really struck me is what in the pre-concert discussion yesterday, Laurent and Kayama were talking about the kind of danger of art. And I mean, over the last few days, I think this is the most varied program of 18th century music I've ever heard. And I think a lot of that variation comes from dance. And I mean, the French were very interested in taking dance forms from other cultures and finding ways to adapt them. I mean, you know, the sarabande obviously is a kind of Spanish Moroccan dance, but it was in every French dance suite all the time. And we often think about the Enlightenment as this, or Enlightenment philosophers were very interested in ideas of universality. At the same time, this was an increasingly global age, and we have this huge colonial project that's really ramping up during this time, and a lot of the kind of dance forms that are adapted start to challenge this idea of universality, I think. And I think we especially saw that in the program last night, that you have this huge varied amount of music, huge variation in types and genres of music that's being performed in the colonies, and they're being they're able to show a variety of messages, some of which are quite dangerous to the status quo there. And I think that dance plays a huge role in this because it was something that could be quite easily adapted to these different contexts.
I'll just add that, and we're trying to figure out the French word here, but there's a great Césaire poem about the Haitian Revolution, and he has a line in there which is basically in English, it's like, as a matter of fact, did Dessalines dance about at Vertières, which is the battle where the French were finally defeated. And Dessalines, for instance, was the courts actually of Haiti, the kingdoms of Haiti and Dessalines were really into French dance, and they did these kind of elaborate dances. And actually throughout the Caribbean, you still have these traditions of minuet, that's played with drums, but there's still like preservation of these very specific minuet dances that are played in St. Lucius and elsewhere, with a kind of violin, with the kind of old style of music, but then added drums into it. And what I'll also say is that in Saint-Domingue in the 18th century, we see that there begins to be performances on stage of black dance, and there's an emergence of blackface performances as early as the middle of the 18th century. So the blackface performance that will become very familiar and really actually the most popular form of entertainment in North America in the early 19th century has some of its origins or kind of roots in the Caribbean. There's in fact an incredible ad for a blackface performance in the 1770s that says that this white performer will perform in blackface, and the word in French is pour s'approcher de l'illusion du naturel, which means to get closer to the illusion of the natural, which is an incredibly interesting and kind of almost Derridian way of describing it. But there's this kind of emergence of essentially trying to appropriate what everyone is seeing and hearing outside the theater, because at the market, in Congo Square, on plantations, people would have heard drums all the time. They would have seen dancing. It's really very, very present, actually. We know from the landscapes and so forth, the sort of engravings that show it. But then, and then kind of entering onto the stage, and there were some black performers, it seems, who did make it outside Minette as well. So it's really, and again, in the novel, we keep repeating, so in Dance on the Volcano, you really get a sense of some of that intricacy kind of laid out very beautifully in the prose. That this kind of danger, which is you're kind of closed, you're trying to keep certain things on the stage, but then of course the stage opens up to the cultures that are surrounding it.
Yes. As I listened to your rich discussion about the confluence of various cultures, I'm impressed that you had the performances at El Museo del Barrio.
There was a certain sense to that, wasn't there? Yes, and that was the first time we'd done a stage opera there, actually. And those gorgeous murals of them. That's so unusual. And it was built as an orphanage, maybe some of you know. And that's why those are there. I just want to pick up, I guess, on Callum's mention, and somebody else mentioned too, the variety within music within this period. And for me, one of the striking things, I guess, about Sylvain, that Leon did, was even within it, you went from very light music to some sort of soul-searching and agonizing, and of course, Victor, who had to go out on an errand to travel before traveling, it played the part of Sylvain as a quite tormented son, but that is very much supported by his first aria, which is so dramatic. and in so many different sections. And then, of course, his wife has that great company recitation later. And I think, I don't know why I'm continually surprised by this, because I've been doing this music for 40 years. But in Germany they call it the Sturm und Drang in the 1760s, and then we did this Le Déserteur, which was considered very proto-romantic, released in 1769. And Sylvain turns out is the next year, so we think Gretry must have been influenced by it. But I really heard that in your program, that Sandrine too. I mean, even amidst all the delicacy of that, the darkness or some of the crumbles was really striking to me, and I mean it was in the decorum of a salon to express that kind of dark sentiment. And I wonder if you want to say something about that on your program.
Yes, that's why also I put quite a lot of pieces by him, because I find he's a really interesting composer, because he went very far in the expression and also in the harmonical adventures, also for this type of harp, because as you maybe understood, the harp is a single action, so you cannot move in you cannot go in every tonalities. But he knew from inside the harp so well that he could really push the harp to the limits, the harmonical language for the harp. And I think he was a very tormented person, and very talented, also multi-talented, because he went to the harp only when he was 25 years old, and he became a virtuoso, and he was encouraged to compose by Haydn. But he was also unsure of himself, and he was traveling. It's very interesting to see the complicated and adventurous life of the composer of this time. They were always changing places, and so yes, indeed, I find that his music is really Sturm und Drang, very tormented, and really announcing the early romanticism.
And yet you contrast it, then you do an instrumental piece like the Saint Georges, which is so simple emotionally by comparison.
Yes, exactly, but also very charming and very refined. But indeed, yeah, and I think I wanted to show also that Marie Antoinette, she had I think very wide taste in a way, which was made more by intuition and a true passion to music than really education. But so she could like Gretry as much as Gluck, and So I think it shows the richness of the musical scene at her time, and I think in a way she was also bringing the taste to a new style again.
Julia's point about as a Antoinette, as at least in the French context, as a musical progressive, really. Yeah.
I was curious about instrumentation, and including in the New Mexico context, because one of the things that struck me. Oh, I'm sorry, Julia. What are you about to do?
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Just that there are these images. We have images of African harps in Saint-Domingue and in Suriname and those places, right? There were these smaller kind of portable harps. And at the same time, actually, the kora in West Africa is emerging in the 18th century as a kind of harp. And so I think it's interesting to think, too, that there was, in all these places, there were different instruments, maybe in this theater, but then also outside of it. And I don't know about indigenous or the guitar or other kinds of instruments, but that was another thing that struck me, is that there is also this whole, there are like a lot of different traditions of musical instruments that are encountering each other in the Americas, that have already, there's a deeper history of that in Europe, obviously North African instruments circulating. It's just another piece of the puzzle, I think, that's kind of interesting.
And you've written a book on the banjo. Right?
Yeah. So the banjo, which emerges in this context, but even the history of the guitar and lutes in Europe, which come from North Africa, and it was partly this question about that instrument, realizing that there's a whole sort of it's called organology, and that's specific, but there's a kind of, there too, of course, because instruments carry all kinds of signification, and a message in a certain way, and so forth. So I just wanted to say that when I was listening to the incredible harp music you were playing, I was just thinking about all these harp traditions that span Europe and Africa.
A big question that just reminds me from Maria. One of the things, Maria, there hasn't Arnie. Arnie is a member of what is the last sort of active penitentes church in the Hermanos in southern Colorado. There's still some in northern New Mexico. But when they took us to the sea, literally see the enclosure of the commons, by going to the edge of the mountain and seeing this huge bulldozer take away the side of the mountain and put in this huge 10-foot fence. It's right next, they did that right next to Arnie's Morada. And the Morada is the place where, because there weren't enough priests to go around in the 19th century, there were lay priests who became and formed this sect, I guess, called the Hermanos. But I wondered, is there a musical tradition within the Hermanos?
Mm-hmm.
And is it mostly sung? Is it also played? Is it?
Well, the Moradas sing very old, probably it seems Moorish, their songs. But in talking about this, I have to just mention it, is protest as theater. And we had an owner that enclosed another person that bought the mountain track and continually raised the fence higher and higher and higher, was involved in Enron at the highest level. And but when we protested, now that I think about it, it was almost like we were chanting even with puppets and going with puppets and chanting, and so it was a different kind of singing, but it was very ritual and very spiritual protest. But that's what the Morada does. And they're the ones that when anybody dies, they go and they sing the rosary, and they're there if anybody needs wood, if anybody needs food, that's what they do. And my cousin and I, we come from 2 generations of county coroners, and they're the ones that pronounce people dead. And so that's part of, of the ritual. And little small communities, you have to do everything. And so part of it is it's in relations to, it's a protest in a way, but there's lots of literature on the penitente singing that, I'm not prepared to talk about, but it's still very powerful, but it's winding down, and it's, but part of it is that this fence is right next to this male lay ministers. And so that's kind of where we're at. We're at the edge of this.
And every Easter they do the Calvario, which is to go up on the hill, but now they're prevented from.
And a little cavalry, and they go and they sing and they make a procession. And so we grew up with these during the feast days. People would walk and sing during the feast days. So there is a different kind of singing. There is definitely in the churches, but there's these other lay groups pick it up, and so that's kind of our tradition that we come from.
We were thinking of using that in Silva, except that it was a lot easier for just for Heu to take his guitar and play a little bit of the song he just sung. He said, well, that I can do, but learn something entirely new.
Let me just interject. The Hermanos Penitentes have a very distinctive song style. Yeah. They have what they call hymns of sorrow, which are sung during Lent, alabados, and then alabanzas, which are hymns of praise. And it's an extremely distinct singing style that probably has origins in both Native American intonations as well as Moorish sources.
And just one thing, it was all memorized. nobody read from a book. It was all these elderly men that had all this for 2 hours they could talk, or 3 hours. And it was all in their head, and it was all memorized.
So it's
It is.
an oral tradition then.
It's an oral tradition.
Some questions. We've gone on and about for a while, but maybe you have some interesting things.
I've had one about Sylvan since the other night. Did you do any editing of it, or was it always that concise?
We did some editing, surprisingly little, both in terms of taking out, so there was no section taken out, there were lines taken out. But it is, the situations move so quickly. We were so grateful for Nathan Berg to be able to take that cameo appearance at the end and sort of make something of it, because he has to sort of transition from the indignant, the audacity of all this to suddenly be very quickly. So, there's, I mean, it's an interesting libretto, as I've used the word. It's a little bit of a preachy libretto, as we've said, which was one of its criticisms of the day. But he makes his point none too subtly, but he was making a point, and it was. So.
I'd also say that at the theater where that work was premiered at the Comédie Italienne, it was customary to actually have three works a night. So the show would start at 5, and then you get a little opener, and then probably 2 opera comique. So I don't know, Ryan, you could have done several more operas to have part of this.
It's tired already. It was enough to get this far, let alone the week. It was enough to do just that. As you know, we of course grew ourselves from chamber as a group into an opera company. I don't know, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? But it's been fun, and it was. Yes.
I want to just make a little comment. You mentioned earlier how throughout the 3 programs, Greffi was present. And beyond that, there is a work of Greffi called Lucille, which precedes Sylvain, and had one quartet. Où est-on mieux qu'au sein de la famille? Where is one happier than in the midst of family? Which was a big hit at the time. Such a hit, a bit like Plaisir d'amour. The words, where are you better than in the midst of your family, were then used both in an ironic context to mean things are dreadful here.
I'm going to kind of get out.
Throughout the revolutionary period and even under Napoleon. So we have in this context really a master of ambiguity.
Yeah. There wasn't his daughter also named Lucille? And she was a composer too, but she died very young. Who knows what she could have been.
So what are you working on next?
Well, we decided over the course of the next 3 years to sort of focus on each one woman in the 18th century. And so we're going backwards chronologically. And next year we'll do the era of Madame de Pompadour. And that will take us we actually have, believe it or not, the premiere of a Rameau opera. Not the modern premiere of a Rameau opera, but the premiere of a Rameau opera. In that, he wrote but did not finish it. But he got as far as bringing in the character. You have Jupiter, and you have Apollo, and you have Io, and then you have La Folie. And given that he brought in La Folie and the plot's almost the same, the French musicologist Sylvie Bouissou has assumed, it seems almost obvious now in retrospect that she's done it, that this was a study for Platée, his great comedy. So she has finished it with some music from Platée. And so that will be one piece, and then the companion piece will be a work by de Lagarde, which actually Madame de Pompadour performed herself, and which has just come to light in a score that was purchased by Friends of Opera Lafayette and others for the Bibliothèque Nationale. And in gratitude, if you will, they allowed us to do the first performance. So are allowing us to do the first performance of it. So that's an exciting sort of centerpiece, and then it will be framed around Madame de Pompadour. So stay tuned.
Has it been sure to talk about the third season?
Well, I don't want to give it all away, but we go then back to Madame de Maintenon. And so 17, Louis XIV dies in 1715, and at the end of his long life, as some of you may know, he sort of secretly married, essentially, a very religious woman named Madame de Maintenon, and the court sort of went a little bit dark, and it was grim. But right after he died, people got really excited to go back to the theater, and so we're going to give a piece that I won't reveal just yet, which is about that excitement of one of the first comedies that was done just after he died, and kind of in reaction to this, as well as set the stage for it by giving some of the music that was done in sponsored. I mean, it wasn't that she wasn't musical; it was just that everything was in a religious or a much more contained context and less frivolous.
I have another question. I was intrigued about the comment that the theater taking on the narrative among the illiterate. That was the traditional role of the church. How aware was the church and the exponents of the theater of the usurpation of that role, or did they see it as complementary? I'm sure it was about a mix of complementary.
But yeah, I think that's exactly the point. That's key, that in the 18th century, there is a way in which it usurps some of the role of the churches, right? And as you get theaters in all these different towns and places, I think there's definitely some kind of competition. And of course, the messages in the theater were often very different than the messages in the church. Although, they were secular, they were often they were a bit scandalous, they often were about, romantic relationships, et cetera, right? So even that sort of thing, which maybe on the surface of it isn't openly political, was political in a sense that it kind of undermined maybe traditional ideas. And so I think that's very much the case. Of course, there was also lots of crossover and intersection between them. And again, in the Americas, where you have in New Mexico and in the Caribbean and elsewhere, you also just have the emergence of all of these religious practices that are themselves theatrical, but in different ways, and in the Caribbean context that are drawing on African, various forms of dance and you can call it theater, but or performance that's very present. And these things, I think sometimes people sort of these things were really, really present. I mean, in a place like Saint-Domingue, 90% of the population was enslaved. More than half were African-born people who had, in many cases, just arrived 6 months before from Congo or West Africa. And that was the dominant sound. That was the kind of dominant landscape in a certain way, even if imposed by a plantation landscape. And in a city like New Orleans, similarly. So it wasn't really written down, and so we kind of forget how present those sounds were. But when you study it, you can kind of see that as well. So, but I do think that the point that I was trying to make is that the theatrical worlds, they're opening up all this kind of space for people to imagine different realities in a certain way, in a way that fiction, is doing it at the same time as well. But it's certainly a competition, yeah.
I don't want to end on a grim note, but as you mentioned this, and when you were talking yesterday, one of the facts which we talked about in our online seminar keeps coming back to me, and I think it's worth remembering. And I don't just the the population the enslaved population was dying young, and the figures on how many millions of people came through and died in and were constantly being replenished through Africa. So the figures, it was a chart you showed, which is just astounding. And I don't think we should.
That's important too. I mean, these were there were spaces of death in many ways, right? Death was very, very present in a lot of the, in colonial landscapes in general and indigenous spaces. I mean, in Saint-Domingue, there were over 1 million enslaved people brought into the colony in the 18th century, and at the end of that time, there was about 400,000 enslaved people, right? So you can just get a sense of, and in the years before the revolution, about 40 or 50,000 were being brought every year. So if you look at it's called slave trade voyages, you can kind of look and study this, clearly it's all kind of laid out and archived. But I do think that's important. It's very important to remember, obviously, that and the revolutions that unfolded in Haiti unfolded in the context of what was a kind of an ever-present war, which was slavery itself, right? In a way that was a kind of war against people and yeah.
So when we're talking about the theaters, just to go back and say, what percentage of the population in Saint-Domingue is white? What percentage is free black, and what percentage is enslaved?
I mean, very schematically, it's like 90% enslaved and then 10% free people, split basically between people of African descent and white. And the white population itself has a small number of really wealthy planters, but a significant number of managers and kind of less wealthy whites as well. So the plantocracy is actually very small. And then there's so the groups that Minette was a part of, for instance, made up about 5% of the population. But
where did they come from? The free blacks that came from it. I mean, what were they doing? What was their professions or what?
Well, the free people are usually the children. In many cases, some are manumitted, so they gain their freedom in some way, and then others are children or descendants of of not marriages, but of relationships between enslaved people and masters. But then by the second or third generation, these are just whole families that are constituted that become kind of thriving families.
But they don't generally come from Africa as free.
No. These are all within the colonies.
One of the beautiful little books that we read with Kayama and Laurent is called The Infamous Rosalie, and by Evelyn Puyo, which, in addition to the much larger kind of expansive dancehall volcano, I recommend to anybody who's interested in that subject. I'd also mention that in the context of familiar work in the context of New Mexico is Willie Cather's Death Comes to the Archbishop. It's about one of these French prelates who comes and in fact tries to put a lid on the Thomas Gura who is trying to speak for the local populations and. During this period from the I don't know when he shows up, he's there through the 1870s for 30 or 40 years as Nilami, the French. So there's some of this is peripherally documented in interesting ways. Yes?
I apologize if this is already covered in the program, as I haven't read them all yet, but I was wondering about the pricing of the theater, because you're talking about popular ideas spreading, so that means that presumably it was cheap enough that ordinary people could go. But I mean, presumably the poorest of the poor are not going, but maybe what class would be the least able? I mean, what would be the minimum price, the minimum social class that could go? Maybe artisans?
So you're talking about in Saint-Domingue? Or in France? Or
It could be both in the metropole and in the colony.
Well, certainly, that's one for you.
I can talk about the French context, and I'll leave it to others to talk about the colonial context. In France, the theater becomes, so on one hand, theater is free. There are free Sunday performances sometimes, so there are days in which the theaters are more open. It very much varies. Of course, Marie Antoinette pays tens of thousands of livres a year for her box subscriptions. The tickets in the parterre, or sort of the general standing room, are accessible to sort of bourgeois and artisan. I would say the thing that has really been showcased correctly or not sort of ambiguously as like a democratizing impulse is actually the thing that is showcased on this last program from yesterday, the idea of the concert spirituel, which is a misnomer. It's not really a fully spiritual concert, but Pedro's program was replicating this idea of a public concert series. And in France, so that this institution as a public concert was founded in France and then replicated in the Caribbean. This is the first concert that exists such as we sort of understand it today, and that it's run by an independent entrepreneur and not the crown, that you're like sitting with total strangers, that you buy a ticket the day of. And those tickets are a couple livres. So it's not cheap, but it's within the realm of possibility of something that a normal person or a poor person could buy. Yeah, but I'll leave it to someone else to talk about that.
I mean, just really quickly, in the colonies, yeah, there was definitely possible to go for less wealthy people, and free people of African descent went. We know there were whole balconies and areas for them, and a lot of them were not. It wasn't too expensive. You also had artisans and soldiers going. And what's also pretty clear, we know this because at a moment when Seine-Maritime refugees are going to New Orleans, there's a kind of new rule put into place in the French theaters that they have to buy tickets when they're bringing their domestic slaves, which suggests that there was a tradition of going with them. In other words, there were probably a fair number of enslaved people who would have been at the events, essentially as attending to, let's say, or accompanying their masters. But I think so. There's clearly, when we think about who's in the theater, it's a pretty mixed group of what the society would have been as well. So
I can make a recommendation. One of my favorite movies of all time, L'Enfant du Paradis. You've seen it then. In the early 1800s, you see the enthusiastic war section in the Paradis, right? And in fact, that's the name of ironic name of a book about Haitian theater too. Is children, not children, but it's what was the fellow's book that says Paradis in the.
This is Jean Fouchard, or are you thinking?
No, there's a more recent story.
Les Enfants du Paradis?
No, it's actually a book about theater in Saint-Domingue and in the Caribbean that has Paradise.
There's
Plantation to Paradise.
Right, From Plantation to Paradise, which is that reference to the theater, to the top seats of the theater. So, anyway, I think we're closing out here in a few minutes, and we haven't exhausted the subject, but we may have exhausted you and ourselves. But we're really happy to have been able to do this, and happy that all of you came to these performances. We hope you enjoyed them. We hope look forward to more. And so, I don't know if is there any coffee or hard donuts left we can take on the way out, please? Okay, there's the box.
Non,